Let's face it, cyber attackers have the advantage. ExtraHop is on a mission to help you take it back. Regain the upper hand with security that can't be undermined, outsmarted, or compromised. When you don't have to choose between protecting your business and moving it forward, that's security uncompromised. See how it works in the full product demo, free online at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. In an overabundance of caution, we have decided to flip this year's Security Weekly Unlocked to a virtual format. The safety of our listeners and hosts is our number one priority. We will miss seeing you all in person, but we hope you can still join us at Security Weekly Unlocked Virtual. The event will now take place on Thursday, December 16th from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. You can still register for free at securityweekly.com/unlocked. All right. Is the death of the password overhyped? There are tons of passwordless products and companies out there. Can it not come soon enough? You know, how are folks stitching passwords? What are the challenges? I've been seeing people talk about this in Slacks, on Twitter. Been hearing a lot of questions from companies on what to do with this, how to deploy it, what the pros and cons are. So it made sense to do a segment just on passwordless, because I do think there's some confusion out there. There's some kind of differing definitions of what passwordless is. Certainly, there's a variety of technologies out there. So we're gonna jump into it here. So I was actually listening to something earlier today. They were talking about when passwords were first introduced on IBM mainframes at MIT in the 1960s, and it was a matter of months before somebody said, "This sucks," found the password file and shared it with everybody and just breached it. Because they were irritated by the additional friction of having to enter a password every time they logged onto the mainframe. And then the access controls, especially at a university, I can see that kind of opinion, but really didn't get a whole lot better. When we got connected to the internet, even before we got connected to the internet and computers were connected to modems, if you go back to Clifford Stoll's Cuckoo's Egg, it's still possible to brute force passwords, still possible to guess them and log into systems. And that has been kind of one of the big banes of security for a long, long time now, especially now that big public breaches with passwords are posted. The RockU breach, that password list still gets pen testers into systems on a regular, probably daily basis. And that password breach is over a decade old. I think it was 2008 or something like that. So my first encounter with passwordless was actually in the early 2000s. We were considering moving to using some of these Sunray from Sun Microsystems, Sunray thin clients that connected to Microsoft Terminal Server. And in the military side, I think they call them CAC, the smart cards. And you just slid these into this little terminal, and your Microsoft desktop would show up. If you remove the smart card, it would log you out. It was amazing. You could walk to another terminal in another building, same card, slide it in, same desktop. Seemed like the future. Maybe it was really expensive. We never did it. I never knew why we didn't go with them. But probably one of the most futuristic things I saw back in 2002, 2003, whenever that was. But yeah, fast forward, didn't really see a whole lot of passwordless take off, aside from the smart card use case. And then we got into the multi-factor authentication age. And that's when things started to get interesting. Now we've got a multitude of additional options. We can use our phone to log in. We can use security keys. We can use everything from SMS messages to push messages, fingerprints, biometrics. All of them come with pros and cons, and it seems like a huge challenge to take an entire enterprise with legacy systems things like that, and move it into this age. I'm going to pause there and let you pick up, Katie. See if you have any comments.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly interesting. We've been talking about passwordless for a really long time, and I think almost every security pro on the planet would be more than happy to see them die their death sooner rather than later. But for whatever reason, your average worker, your average citizen, they become used to passwords, and companies have a very hard time moving off of them. And even, in my non-security life, in just my personal life, signing up for things, opening accounts, trying to buy holiday gifts now, everything requires a password. And so they're persisting, even though we know that they're insecure, even though we know that they're problematic in other ways too. They add friction. We don't think of them as adding friction because we've been using them for so long, but passwords are full of friction. And a lot of these passwordless mechanisms are a lot easier to use, but there's that familiarity aspect that I think is making it harder for enterprises to move forward. And I think there's also somewhat of a misconception that moving to passwordless means A, giving up passwords, and B, requires this massive wholesale shift. And it doesn't mean either of those things. I think companies can do this stepwise. I think they can do it logically. But I think the password's still going to be around for a really, really long time. And I'm glad to see there are a whole bunch of new passwordless vendors out there. And some of them are alike. A lot of them have very different types of solutions that enterprises and consumers can use. So that's really encouraging. And we've seen some new rules too, some new NIST rules that tie into the whole idea of identity and how identity feeds authentication. So I think it's all encouraging, but I do fear a little bit that 5 years from now, we're probably going to be talking about the same issue of why won't the password just die already?
Yeah. So it's interesting. And you're totally right. I think most companies are going to have to do this in stages. There's just no other way about it. Especially an older company with a multitude of different systems. But it's interesting to see. Like we've had components of it for a while. Like if you think about how somebody gets into a Tesla today, it's and even in the past with some Ford vehicles, they actually had some numbers on the side of the car, and you could use a PIN code to get into your car if you lost your keys or forgot your keys or something like that. But with a Tesla, the primary method is your phone. If maybe you don't use a smartphone or you forget your smartphone, you can also have a key fob. You can have a little credit card size thing that goes in your wallet. It's essentially a low frequency RFID signal that it sends. And I think people are getting more and more used to using things that they have to get into things. Smart locks and things like that for the house are becoming more common. The place where I live, we use HID cards to get into things. And yeah, I think using your phone is becoming more and more natural to people to get into things. And I've heard nothing but positive things from folks that work at, maybe cloud first, new startups, that start from the beginning with mostly passwordless stuff. And I think the challenge is just how do we get from here to there for some of the older companies out there?
Yeah, I think it's a lot easier than businesses anticipate. I think there's a little more angst around the idea of moving than the actual reality of moving. Because if you think about it, passwordless in some form has been around, as you mentioned, for a really long time. We've all been and worked in offices, not now, but certainly before the pandemic, early 2000s, where we had those cards to get in, and nobody thought anything about it. You just carried your card with you. That was passwordless authentication. There was plenty of stuff going on behind the scenes to make sure that that key card was provisioned correctly. And there was probably a huge burden on a lot of IT teams because of it. But it's gotten a lot easier. We've had fingerprint scanners on laptops since, I think, somewhere around 2004. They've only more recently become pretty popular and common, but they've been around for a long time. And in the consumer world, we're using facial ID to open our phones or lock our phones. I walk around my block with my dog a couple times a day, and I see, plenty of, the key pads and the, Nest security devices. So it's not as if in the consumer world, people are uncomfortable or unfamiliar with it. There's just something on the enterprise side that it's a big block, and it really shouldn't be, because I think if you can get somebody to use their own phone or their own device in their home in a passwordless way, then it shouldn't be that hard to move them off conceptually. I'm not saying technically, process-wise, it's easy. There's a huge burden on IT and security teams, obviously. But the concept, there seems to be some sort of reticence. But yet, I would bet a lot of the people making the decisions about not moving to passwordless also have some more smart features in their home that actually use passwordless mechanisms.
Yeah, I suspect there's a lot of, we've got so much going on, we don't need to learn a new thing right now, kind of approach to this. And that's where maybe some of the reticence is coming from. And I think some of it's just education, like when I was researching this segment earlier today, I knew on the consumer side, Microsoft had given you the ability to remove your password altogether. You can just get rid of it and just use other factors of authentication to get into your account. But I didn't realize that you could do it on the Office 365 side as well. And I was jumping into the Azure AD settings, and sure enough, there's a passwordless mode that you can flip your users into, and it'll just use MFA from then on. So, I think some of it's education, just understanding how to put this together. And I think ultimately, it's easier to manage. You've got less attack surface to worry about. You're not going to have to do password resets. That's going to be replaced with, other MFA related resets potentially. If you lose a phone or something like that, somebody might need their MFA methods reset. But in general, I see that happening a lot less than people forget their passwords. And sure, we've had self-service for a while, but that's yet another pain to get all that kind of stuff set up. So I think there's really only positives doing this, and it's just going to take a lot of education, for system architects, software engineers, to not automatically reach for password methods when they're building applications in the future.
Right. It's always easier to do what you know. But that's sort of the irony of passwordless, because it moves from, what your password, your ID, to who you are and what you have. And those are all identity-based types of things. And there's something you don't necessarily have to remember and think about. So I think when companies are evaluating the whole idea of passwordless, they have to think more about the people and process related questions. How are you managing passwords right now? How much time does it take? How are you verifying and validating identity? How much time are you spending on authentication now? Things like password resets that you just mentioned. What is the impact of login or authentication friction on your employee or customer satisfaction? Where does that potentially bump up against regulations if there is an incident, a compromise, a breach? And so looking at those questions and asking those are the starting point, I think, to the passwordless journey, if you will. How much time, how resource intensive is it on both the people who are going to implement any potential changes, as well as your consumer, whether that consumer is your employee and your customer, or whether you're a B2C company. It's really, thinking through that migration in terms of time and money. And I think if companies really looked at that a little bit better, a little more closely, they'd say, yeah, this makes sense for so many reasons.
Yeah, so let's jump into the nuts and bolts of passwordless, of what passwordless actually means. And I went out, looked at a bunch of vendors, looked at how they did passwordless, what they were actually calling passwordless, and saw a few different versions of different things. So I think the most common thing we're seeing is, the availability of all these other methods of authentication. Things you have with you, security keys, your smartphone, all kinds of different methods of using your. Honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of security keys because it's another thing that you can lose, that you can forget.
You have to carry it. They're small. They're easy to drop. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're fairly durable, especially the YubiKeys. I've had some other ones that have actually broken on me. The YubiKeys are very durable, but
I meant drop as in like drop between the seat and your car,
Oh, yeah, sure.
I didn't mean break. I meant just, put them somewhere because they're so small and then you can't find them. And then you're in your car for an hour looking under the seat to get into your computer.
I actually had one of these solo keys where the connector just snapped right off. While I was using it. And it was the only factor that I had.
What were you doing? Were you really angry and like?
No, it's just very fragile. I'd maybe used it 100, 200 times, something like that. And, like with something hanging out of a port on a laptop, if you pick it up, move it around, sometimes it gets bent a little bit. So yeah, I'm definitely in favor of the biometrics and using your smartphone. But jumping into the different methods here, some of them mean the employee, the user, whoever just isn't asked for a password. Like you can log in without being asked for a password. But then there's often backup methods. So some of these services will give you a number of backup tokens that you hopefully save in a password database somewhere. That's where I put mine. But in some cases, the password's still there. You just don't have to use it to log in, which doesn't really take away that attack surface. Somebody can still use cred stuffing to get into your account, maybe also using a SIM swap attack or something like that to get the other factor. Still doesn't remove the password, and then there's using MFA techniques where you actually, like with Microsoft, it was a big deal a couple months ago when they allowed you to click a button that literally deleted your password. There is no password factor anymore. It's not even an option. You've got to use one of these MFA features, the Microsoft Authenticator app, something like that. And then I've seen, and I wonder how many of these you've seen, Katie, looking at the enterprise market, where it's more of what I think of as passive authentication, where the device is identifying itself, usually using certificates that are private certificates that are saved on the device. And that's what actually authenticates you, gets you into SSO and some things like that. So literally there's no authentication. It's completely transparent to the user. They just go to the website and they're automatically logged in because of a certificate saved on their device.
Right. Yeah. I think we're seeing a number of vendors offer that kind of functionality. I think it's great. It obviously comes with its own potential risks, right? If the certificate expires, if the user does something on their personally owned device that isn't kosher, there are some risks there. But I think some of these passwordless or so-called passwordless companies are implementing that in a pretty smart way, because once again, the less burden there is on the end user, the better. And, we all carry around our phones. I mean, not everybody. Of course, there are people who don't have smartphones. Of course, there are people who aren't on their laptops and multiple devices the way we are. So this won't be a fix for everybody. But I do think these sort of federated SSO type solutions, they're catching on a lot more, and they definitely have more pros to them than cons, because every type of technology or solution we come up with is going to have some cons to it, just like the password does. But I think we move a lot farther away from it when we're using things like certs to authenticate, and it just automatically says, okay, you're here, we know you're here, we know who you are because of your device and because of the behavior on your device and your device hygiene. So I've definitely seen that in the market, and I think that's going to become a lot more prevalent. I think. I don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah. And then the other kind of passwordless thing that I think of is you log in once, stay logged in forever. Like, how often do you log into the Twitter app on your phone? You don't. You get probably an OAuth token or something like that that's saved on your device, and it passes that off to authenticate. Same thing in your web browser. You log into LinkedIn once, it doesn't log you off every 15 minutes like an enterprise application. You're logged in for months, if not years. I've no idea how long that lasts before it finally logs you out. I mean, maybe if you're coming from a different IP address or something like that, they might say, hey, we don't recognize the system, or we don't recognize this browser, and they try to log you in again. But yeah, this idea of log in once and have some kind of OAuth token, something like that, that's stored as a cookie that keeps you logged in forever. I think we started to see on the consumer side, to the point to where I know people that don't really need a password database, because anytime they need to enter a password, they just use the reset password stuff, because it's so infrequent they have to enter a password. They just go through the reset process every single time. And I'm like, well, that's kind of, that's safer than writing it down, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to that. Years ago, when I was managing conferences, I had a speaker who was advocating for that versus reusing passwords. And he even said, you're safer actually writing down a really long password than you are reusing a password, but you're even better off if you just, quote, forget your password, because then you're constantly resetting it. Well, I guess that requires that you have some decent, you're not on some public Wi-Fi somewhere and exposing everything to the greater world. But it's not terrible. It's not the worst idea, but of course that comes with tons of friction, because every time I have to reset a password, you go through the thing, and every company, every app, every website has different requirements. Some of them say only 20 characters are allowed, and I'm like, why is it limited at 20? And then some of them let you do what you want. So that idea of persistent login and persistent authentication, that scares me a little bit. So I'd actually rather see somebody changing their password because they, quote, forgot their password than storing it another way. But at the same time, I do worry about the idea of, hey, once you get logged in, you're always logged in, and nothing ever changes.
Yeah, I run into a lot of challenges, also forgetting which account I use to log into things. Because a lot of these services now, if you're using some kind of single sign-on, if you're logging in with Apple, or you're logging in with Facebook, or you're logging in with Google, sometimes, especially stuff that I use for work, like Notion, like, am I using my CRA account here? Am I using my Gmail account? And I'll log in Lucidchart. I do this also. I often log in with the wrong account. I'm like, oh, my files are gone. And I realize, no, I need the SSO from a different account. And it's a mess to keep up with. And I don't know how organizations these days manage all that data sprawl, from shadow IT, people, using Evernote, using their own personal accounts to store work data. to be totally honest, for me, yeah, work stuff ends up places that aren't corporate controlled, because a lot of it's just, 12-hour days getting stuff done. Somebody needs access to a report to review it. You either really have to have those processes nailed down and educate your employees on the proper way to share data with third parties and stuff like that, or just accept that, you're going to have some sprawl. You're going to have data all over the place.
Yeah, I think that's probably the reality that we're living in. And I wish there were some company that could come up with a good enough correlation and contextualization engine that could say, when I log in using, one of those, sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, sign in with whomever, it could say, oh, hey, you actually have this account. I have a pretty unique last name, so it might not be as easy for somebody named John Smith, for instance, but it would be great if somebody could say, hey, dummy, you've already logged in here. You already have this account, because once again, you're creating more friction in the authentication process. And, at the heart of it, that's what this all comes down to. Passwordless is, knowing who you are with a high degree of certainty, even if your behavior changes, even if your location changes, even if your device changes, you can still get in if you meet these certain attribute requirements. And to me, that's passwordless. A lot of people listening might have a different opinion. It would be, I know you looked on Twitter and LinkedIn and lots of places, but it would be great if we could do a poll and find out how they are defining passwordless in a larger sense, because I think there probably are at least 5 or 6 accepted definitions at this point.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it depends on your goal. If your goal is to take away user friction, like that's one version of passwordless. If your goal is to remove the password, to get it off the table as a attack surface, as something that trying to prevent account takeover or cred stuffing or something like that, that's another goal that might take you down a different path, going after different technologies. And then the whole device authentication type thing, which isn't just for laptops and employee-facing devices. That's also being used for IoT devices and things in the cloud, stuff like that as well. So there's a lot of use cases here. We especially need better
authentication mechanisms for IoT and cloud, for sure.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about things like HashiCorp Vault, and the DevOps cloud application side of things. How different components of an application log into the database application servers. How all those different components authenticate with each other. Again, more and more, I see a lot of that moving to passive stuff like certificates and trust relationships, and less, having to store a clear text password somewhere, gets pulled out of that file and sent across the network.
Yeah, it's an issue that sort of gets into one of our news stories, talking about AI generated code. You're talking about vault generated passwords here. There's a little bit of a thread. We're going to eventually get into that, but it's an interesting topic, and I certainly see more companies looking at passwordless. I think, or I did when I was in the position to be talking to enterprises, more adoption of it, more acceptance of it, but we're still at a pretty low rate at this point.
Yeah, I saw a really interesting use case the other day. I've got a few anecdotes here, and then we'll wrap and we'll move on to the news. We'll take a quick break, but so one use case I saw, somebody was using, I think it was Rapid7 and Thycotic, and the use case was every time it did a credentialed scan with the vulnerability scanner, Thycotic would give it a unique password to use on that system every time. And that password was only good for that one use. And which is great, because something I've noticed before, and I know some pen testers that use this, you can just fire up like an SSH server or different types of services. And if somebody owns ServiceNow mid servers will just go out and try and log into things. It's just part of the asset management functionality. And when they try and log into it, they're giving you the password for that service account that's used in the entire organization to log into systems and gather asset data. So literally all you have to do is be on the network, set up some services that ServiceNow is going to hand off a password to, and wait. And ServiceNow will come give you the password for the rest of the network, which is insane to me that's how in a lot of organizations ServiceNow is operating. Just like reverse password spraying. Like they're spraying the password to you instead of attackers spraying passwords trying to get into your systems.
Well, it sure is convenient.
For the attacker, yeah. For the pen tester, absolutely.
I mean, isn't that our goal in security?
And then another great experience for me, talking about fingerprint readers on laptops. I've got my first laptop, got a framework laptop, which is really cool. If you're big into right to repair, the whole thing is designed to be easy to replace components on, to repair. And it has a fingerprint reader, and I decided to run Linux on it. And one of the cool things that I didn't realize is by default, if you've got a fingerprint reader in Linux, when you try to sudo or you su to root, it asks you there in the command line to use your fingerprint, so you don't have to type a password. So it's kind of neat to me to be sitting at a command line and using my fingerprint to sudo, to run sudo commands.
There was something that popped up on my laptop the other day. In the future, would you like to use your fingerprint to authenticate? And I was in a rush, so I just said no. And then I thought about it after I clicked it off, and I can't even remember what it is. And I hope it pops back up, because that would be way easier than my password isn't 700 characters long or anything. My master password, because of course I use a password vault. Actually, technically now I use 2 password vaults. But yeah, just using that fingerprint, so much easier.
Yeah, that's how I get into a lot of apps on my phone now. That's how I get into my password database on all my systems, pretty much. But yeah, very, very convenient.
Although I did have an issue on my phone a couple months ago where it just simply stopped recognizing my face. I haven't done anything. This is all natural, for better or worse. But it stopped recognizing my face, and I couldn't get into my phone, unless I did my little swipey thing with my pattern, which isn't highly complicated. I don't think highly secure either, actually, because I can't imagine there are that many patterns that people could do unless they do a bazillion swipes. But it locked me out of Face ID, and then it wouldn't let me add a new one. And so for 2 days, I was out without my Face ID, and it was a pain in the butt, honestly. I was really pissed. I was very excited when I got it back.
Yeah, I've heard some of those stories, and personally, I'm just stuck on give me a fingerprint reader. Yeah, I don't want to have to do Face ID on any devices. I'd much rather do.
Yeah, my phone just doesn't come with it, and I wish it had the fingerprint. My tablet has a fingerprint, but it doesn't always recognize that either. I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, so that was actually one of the we didn't get into all the details, all the notes I had here, but that's one of the drawbacks of biometrics is that there's something like 5% of the population, I forget exactly what the percentage is, but it's not insignificant, that can't use biometrics reliably for some reason, just because the technology doesn't work for everybody, or maybe there's something weird about their fingerprints. I don't know.
Way back, and I think it was in about 2003, 2004, when these fingerprint readers on laptops first came out. I was working at a company for a very short period of time. They're not on my resume. They're not on my LinkedIn. Kind of sketchy little company. But one of the executives purchased one of these brand new laptops. And we were going to do a demo with a very, very large client. They are a household name. They are in the automotive industry, and we get there, and there are about 25 executives sitting around the table, and he opens up his laptop, and he's demonstrating his new functionality, and he's all excited, right? And his fingerprint reader wouldn't work, and he couldn't get in. I didn't have the demo on my laptop. My password full laptop that I could have easily opened up. He was, I'm going to take it. I'm the executive here. I've got the demo. You just sit there and be quiet. But his fingerprint reader didn't work, and we were sitting in this meeting with a large number of executives from Fortune 10, and couldn't get in because the technology wasn't good enough. It had broken, and there we were for an hour without any kind of demo, any kind of visuals.
An hour. I would love to see the calculation.
We didn't stay the whole hour,
expensive,
obviously, but we had an hour booked.
Yeah, I would love to. You could calculate how expensive that mistake was, how expensive that failure was. Take all the executive salaries in that room. What's an hour of their time worth? Combine all that. That's an expensive fingerprint login failure.
Yeah.
Well, more of an ego failure, since you could have just stepped in, and that's insane to me. I don't know why somebody would insist on getting it working rather than just getting the meeting going. But anyway, we should probably wrap this up.
That's a whole other topic for a whole other episode.
Yeah. Work personalities. All right. Yeah. So if you have any opinions on passwordless trends, any thoughts, any questions on it, if you think we should do another one of these. One of the things I wanted to do was actually some live demos. I just didn't have time to prep for that. This was kind of a last minute. We had an interview cancel on us, and we just wanted to get something interesting in here, and decided to experiment doing a segment where we talked about a market category where I felt was maybe a bit confusing, misunderstood, something like that. So let us know if there's other categories like this that you'd like to know more about. Send me into research mode, and I'll do my best to come on here and explain it for you. But with that, we'll be right back in a few moments with the news.